Trump just called the Iran ceasefire over. China already saw this coming. 3 days ago, standing at a NATO summit in Turkey, Donald Trump said something that should have moved markets more than it did. The ceasefire with Iran, he said, is over. Within hours, American jets had hit 90 targets inside Iran. Within hours after that, missiles were flying at Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan. But here's the detail that actually matters, the one buried under the noise. While all of this has been happening, China has quietly refused to bring its oil imports back to where they were before the war started, even after the strait supposedly reopened. Why would the country most dependent on that oil be the one most reluctant to buy it? What does Beijing know, or think it knows, that the rest of the market doesn't? Before we begin, if you enjoy our independent geopolitical analysis, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It helps us continue creating in-depth content like this, and you'll never miss an important development. Thank you for your support, and now, let's get started. 3 days ago, in Ankara, at a NATO summit that was supposed to be about Ukraine and European defense spending, Donald Trump said something almost in passing that should have rattled markets far more than it did. Asked about the ceasefire he'd brokered with Iran a few weeks earlier, he shrugged and said it was over. As far as he was concerned, done. Within hours, American forces had struck roughly 90 targets across Iran, hitting air defense systems, coastal surveillance posts, missile and drone storage sites, and naval infrastructure along the coast. Within hours after that, Iran's Revolutionary Guard had fired missiles and drones at American allies across the Gulf, setting off air raid sirens in Kuwait and Bahrain, and eventually reaching as far as Qatar and Jordan. If you only watched the headlines, this looked like a war reigniting. And in a narrow sense, it was. But there's a second story running underneath this one, quieter and in some ways more revealing. And it doesn't involve a single missile. It involves oil that isn't being bought. Let's establish the timeline first, because the details here carry real weight. This war began on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran, killing the country's supreme leader along with a number of senior officials and destroying a substantial portion of Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure. Iran's response was to strike back at Israel and at American bases across the region and, critically, to close the Strait of Hormuz. For anyone unfamiliar with why that single stretch of water matters so much, here's the plain version. Before the war, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil passed through the Strait of Hormuz every single day, along with a substantial share of the world's liquefied natural gas. There is no easy alternative route. Pipelines exist that can bypass the strait for some Gulf producers, but nowhere near enough capacity to replace what normally flows through those 30-some miles of water between Iran and Oman. When Iran declared the strait closed and began mining it and attacking tankers, global oil markets didn't just react, they convulsed. Analysts have since described it as the largest energy shock since the 1970s oil crisis, and by some measures, larger than that. Brent crude spiked to around $126 a barrel in March, a level that would have seemed almost unthinkable at the start of the year. Now here's where China enters the picture, and why this becomes less a Middle East story and more a story about the two largest economies on Earth circling each other. China imports roughly half its crude oil and close to a third of its liquefied natural gas through the Strait of Hormuz. That is an enormous dependency for any single country to carry, and it's exactly the kind of vulnerability that keeps energy planners in Beijing up at night. So why didn't China panic when the strait closed? Because, as it turns out, Beijing had been quietly preparing for exactly this scenario for years. As of early March, China held an estimated 1.39 billion barrels of oil in storage, enough to cover roughly 120 days of net imports at recent consumption levels. On top of that, there were tens of millions of barrels of Iranian oil already sitting in floating storage across Asian waters, plus additional volumes in bonded storage at ports like Dalian and Zhoushan. Oil that technically hadn't even cleared customs yet, but was sitting there, ready. Add to that the ability of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to reroute a combined 5 million barrels a day away from the strait entirely, some of which would flow toward Chinese buyers. And you start to understand why China's reaction to the largest energy shock in half a century was essentially calm. That calm is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you something about the difference in how these two superpowers experience the same crisis. For the United States, a closed Strait of Hormuz is primarily a market problem, a price spike that ripples through gas pumps and inflation numbers and, eventually, votes. For China, it's a strategic vulnerability that Beijing has spent years actively engineering its way around, not because it expected this particular war, but because it has never trusted that a choke point controlled by American naval power and threatened by Iranian mines would remain reliably open forever. That's the deeper subtext to everything that follows. Washington has been fighting to keep the strait open because it believes an open strait serves the global economy and, not incidentally, American strategic interests in the region. China has been quietly building the capacity to shrug if it closes anyway. Washington's response to China's continued Iranian oil purchases has been anything but subtle. In April, the Treasury Department sanctioned a major Chinese refinery, one of the so-called teapot refineries that process large volumes of Iranian crude, along with roughly 40 shipping companies and tankers involved in moving that oil. The refinery in question, Hengli Petrochemical, had reportedly generated hundreds of millions of dollars for Iran's military simply by continuing normal business. Treasury officials didn't stop there. They sent formal letters to financial institutions across China, Hong Kong, the UAE, and Oman, warning that continued Iranian oil purchases would trigger secondary sanctions, the kind that can freeze a bank's access to the dollar-based financial system entirely. Around the same time, the Trump administration floated something even more aggressive, a threat of an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods if Beijing supplied advanced defense equipment to Tehran. China's response was to invoke what are known as blocking rules, legal mechanisms that essentially forbid Chinese companies from complying with the new American sanctions regime. It was the first time Beijing had used those rules in this context, and analysts have called it an important test case for how far China is willing to go to insulate itself from American economic pressure. Then, in April, Trump ordered something even more dramatic, a full naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, targeting any vessel entering or leaving Iranian ports regardless of flag. The stated purpose was to choke off Iran's remaining oil revenue entirely until a deal was reached. The practical effect was to freeze what little tanker traffic had resumed after a brief ceasefire, stranding hundreds of vessels and reigniting fears of a prolonged supply shock. Analysts at the time pointed out the obvious tension in this strategy. A blockade aimed at pressuring Iran would inevitably catch China in the crossfire too, since China remained Iran's largest oil customer throughout the war. That risked dragging Washington into a second front of confrontation, this time economic rather than military, at a moment when the administration was also trying to manage the broader US-China trade relationship. One analyst put it bluntly on financial television: taking the only oil still flowing out of the Gulf off the market entirely could push prices toward $150 a barrel, and doing that specifically at China's expense was not a fight the administration seemed fully prepared for. That tension came into sharp focus in mid-May, when Trump traveled to Beijing for the first presidential visit to China in nearly a decade. On paper, the agenda covered trade, technology, and the broader bilateral relationship. In practice, the Strait of Hormuz crisis hovered over almost every conversation. China is arguably the one country with real leverage over Iran, and American officials had spent weeks publicly calling on Beijing to use it. Beijing's response throughout the war had been notably cautious, its most significant intervention reportedly being quiet pressure on Tehran to accept the terms of an earlier ceasefire attempt. That caution wasn't an accident. It was Beijing positioning itself to extract concessions of its own before offering any real help. During the summit, Trump signaled he was considering lifting sanctions on Chinese companies buying Iranian oil and noted that Xi Jinping wanted to see the strait automatically reopened without any formal American concession attached to it. Notably absent from the public readouts were serious discussions of semiconductor export controls, an issue China clearly wanted to avoid conceding on. And when reporters asked Trump directly whether the U.S. would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack, he declined to answer. Two leaders, each holding cards close, each trying to extract something from the other's Middle East headache without giving up anything on their own core priorities. By mid-June, diplomatic pressure had produced something resembling progress. On June 17th, the United States and Iran signed what's now known as the Islamabad Memorandum, a formal agreement that ended the immediate fighting, lifted the American naval blockade, waived sanctions on Iranian oil sales, and set a 60-day window for negotiating a final comprehensive deal. Crucially, and this detail matters enormously for everything that's happened since, the memorandum required Iran not to interfere with civilian shipping through the strait. Iran's interpretation of that clause turned out to be very different from Washington's. Tehran read it as granting Iran sole authority over how ships transit the strait, including the right to charge tolls and dictate approved routes. Washington read it as requiring unrestricted passage, full stop. That gap in interpretation is not a technicality. It's the fault line the entire ceasefire has been sitting on ever since. And here's where the China story resurfaces, because even after the memorandum was signed and tanker traffic began cautiously resuming, China's oil imports never rebounded to anywhere close to pre-war levels. One energy analyst described this as the detail almost nobody was paying enough attention to. China didn't just reduce consumption modestly in response to higher prices, the way you'd expect during a supply shock. China cut its imports dramatically, well beyond what falling demand alone would explain. That's not simple economics, that's a strategic choice. It suggests Beijing isn't convinced the reopening is durable and would rather keep drawing down its enormous stockpiles and wait for either lower prices or greater certainty than commit to buying back into a market that could seize up again at any moment. Given everything that's happened since, that caution looks less like overcaution and more like foresight, because the ceasefire didn't hold. In late June, Iran launched drone attacks on container ships transiting the strait, prompting a first round of American strikes in response. Then, on July 8th and 9th, it happened again, this time far more severely. Iran attacked 3 commercial vessels in or near the strait. The United States responded by revoking its sanctions waiver on Iranian oil sales and launching a wave of strikes, roughly 90 targets across 2 consecutive nights, aimed explicitly at degrading Iran's capacity to threaten shipping. Iran retaliated with missile and drone strikes against Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan, several of which activated air defenses and intercepted incoming projectiles. It was in the middle of this exchange, at a press conference in Ankara, that Trump declared the ceasefire over, describing Iran's leadership in some of the harshest personal terms he's used throughout the entire war, and admitting he wasn't sure he wanted to pursue a deal at all. Iran's chief negotiator responded on social media with a warning of his own. Any further American strikes would be met with further Iranian retaliation, framing the dispute over strait access as a matter Tehran would decide unilaterally going forward. So where does that leave things right now, as of this recording? Oddly, not entirely at square one. Despite Trump's public declaration, Iranian officials have signaled continued openness to talks, and a Qatari delegation has reportedly been accepted for further mediation, even as Tehran denies formally requesting new negotiations. Analysts following the process closely describe the current dynamic as something close to symbolic theater layered over a genuine standoff. Both sides have real incentives to avoid a full return to war. The conflict remains deeply unpopular domestically in the United States and poses a real risk to Trump's party heading into November's midterm elections. Iran's economy, already battered by months of blockade and strikes, badly needs the sanctions relief and access to frozen funds that a final deal would unlock. Neither side wants to be the one seen walking away from the table, but neither side has resolved the actual disagreement over who controls passage through the strait. And that disagreement is precisely the kind of unresolved technical dispute that keeps reigniting into military exchanges every few weeks. There are two dates worth marking on your calendar if you want to understand where this goes next. The first is August 21st, when the current sanctions relief authorizing Iranian oil sales is set to expire. If it isn't extended, and given the current state of hostilities, that's a real possibility, oil supply pressure returns almost immediately, regardless of what's happening on the water. The second is November, the American midterm elections, which several analysts have flagged as a moment when a struggling ceasefire could either get a final diplomatic push to avoid embarrassing the administration or collapse entirely if Trump calculates that looking tough on Iran plays better politically than looking accommodating. Both dates sit inside a market that's already extraordinarily fragile. Oil prices have swung from a peak above $125 a barrel in March down to around $70 by mid-July, a collapse driven partly by optimism around the ceasefire and partly by a genuine supply response, with American production hitting a record high of nearly 14 million barrels a day in April alone. Some analysts now warn that if China's imports do eventually rebound at the same moment, American, Canadian, Brazilian, and Argentine output stays elevated, the market could tip from crisis into oversupply almost as fast as it tipped into crisis in the first place. Others argue that's wishful thinking, and that the more likely outcome, given the unresolved dispute over strait access, is another spike back toward $90 a barrel or higher before the year is out. Step back from the day-to-day exchange of strikes and statements, and what you're actually looking at is a preview of how energy security gets contested in a world where the United States can no longer simply dictate terms and expect compliance. Washington's entire post-war strategy in the Gulf has rested on the assumption that American naval power and sanctions leverage can keep the strait open on American terms. China's entire strategy has rested on the assumption that no single choke point, however critical, should be allowed to become an existential vulnerability, and that stockpiles, diversified suppliers, and simple patience are worth more than confrontation. Both approaches are being tested simultaneously by the same crisis in real time, and neither government has been fully vindicated yet. Washington's sanctions and blockades have pressured Iran, but also pushed Beijing to double down on self-sufficiency rather than fall in line. Beijing's patience has protected it from the worst of the price shock, but hasn't given it any real say over when or how the underlying conflict resolves. Iran, weakened and increasingly desperate for sanctions relief, is left negotiating from a position that gets marginally worse every time it decides to test the limits of the ceasefire with another attack on shipping. There's also a piece of this that rarely makes it into daily coverage, but matters for anyone thinking about where this heads next. The disruption hasn't just hit oil and gas. Reports have described a near-total disruption of certain critical mineral supplies through the strait, including sulfur, a shortage serious enough to affect elements of the American defense industrial base. China, for its part, has responded by restricting exports of sulfuric acid, a move with its own ripple effects across manufacturing supply chains that have nothing directly to do with Iran. Once a choke point this significant seizes up, in other words, the damage doesn't stay contained to the commodity everyone's watching. It spread sideways into industries nobody was thinking about when the first missile was fired. Watch the next 24 to 72 hours closely, because they'll tell you a great deal about which direction this actually breaks. Watch whether the Qatari mediation effort produces anything concrete, or whether it quietly fades the way earlier rounds of talks did. Watch whether Iran attempts another strike on shipping in the strait, since that pattern, strike, American retaliation, regional counterstrikes has now repeated itself at least 3 times since the war supposedly ended. And watch China's import numbers over the coming weeks specifically, because if Beijing starts quietly rebuilding its purchases toward pre-war levels, that's a signal it believes the worst is genuinely behind us. If it doesn't, that tells you Beijing still expects this fragile equation to break again before it holds. What do you think happens first, a real diplomatic resolution or another round of strikes? Let us know where you're watching from and how you think this settles, because this is a story that's still being written in real time.